I'm going to give you a little background information as well as a sort of overview of the exhibition. I don't know how many of you have already seen it. If you haven't, I encourage you to see it. It's a wonderful opportunity to have these fantastic paintings here. Dalí and Magritte are an interesting pair who represent a kind of second moment in surrealism. In some ways, their work appears hugely different, but there are things they have in common. But I want to show you both some sort of differences and similarities. So, start with some context and some pieces that are not in the exhibition before I get on to what's in the exhibition. Magritte dealt with very sort of recognizable images, as did Dalí, but the sort of feeling of their works could be incredibly different. This is one of Magritte's most famous paintings, which is in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The Treachery of Images, This Is Not a Pipe, we'll come back to that as well. And Dalí's The Persistence of Memory in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was also one of the first paintings seen in the United States associated with surrealism, which has got a very different sort of feel. One is flat, the other has got a lot of depth to it. One is sort of contradictory, and the other one seems more dreamlike and ethereal. Here's what they both looked like around 1929, 1930, in photographs taken by the same photographer, by Man Ray, who was friendly with both of them and with most of the surrealist group. And of course, the Dalí image became very famous later on when it was reproduced on the cover of Time magazine. Photography was important to both of them. They liked to play around with it in these sort of photo booth type photos that were done very spontaneously. These photos are around this period. Magritte's painting is enigmatic, but not so much in a way that suggests the unconscious mind. He was interested in all sorts of different kinds of literature, including popular detective fiction. So here you have the idea some kind of strange crime has taken place. Big painting, which is in the Museum of Modern Art. Or that, what otherwise looks like straightforward representation is somehow disoriented, as in this 1928 painting. Or in this idea that we sort of have a kind of strange juxtaposition of interior and exterior. Or a disjunction between words and images, which is best embodied in this painting. Magritte once said, "Everything tends to make one think that there is little connection between an object and that which represents it." This was in 1929, he said that. And of course, he complicated our understanding of representation and realism, though he was sort of using the language of realism and the language of traditional painting. He did have a background in commercial design and designed posters and things like that. And he sometimes painted in his early paintings with house paint as opposed to sort of fine oil paints. Here, interior and exterior is juxtaposed, the landscape with the painting. In this portrait from 1937, our expectations are confounded. We don't see in the mirror what we should see. We see a kind of repetition, a kind of mirrors of mirrors of mirrors, but that don't lead us back to our normal optical understanding. And yet, he doesn't really seem to be so fixated on the dark inner world of the unconscious mind in the Freudian sense, as Dalí was. Another sort of paradox here. The exhibition really looks primarily at the connection between the two of them in the 1930s, from the late 20s through the 1930s and briefly into the early 40s. There are a couple of paintings from later periods, but the ideas and images in them are very much related to this key period when they have the most contact between each other. And another one of Magritte's most famous paintings, which is in the Menil collection in Houston, The Rape, where the face of the woman becomes the torso, or the other way around, depending on how you look at it. This is an image he came back to over and over again in different registers. Now, the thing that's kind of odd about Magritte is he tends to repeat himself. So there's cycles in his work where he paints multiple versions of the same painting, and so sometimes there are 4 or 5 versions of a single composition. Sometimes in the same period, other times many years goes by and he comes back to an earlier composition, sometimes painted in a slightly different style, but it's the same subject. That's the case with the Menil painting, which he repeatedly comes back to in later years. Here, for example, are 2 early paintings, The Lovers, the version in the Museum of Modern Art, and another version from right around the same period of these mysterious shrouded figures. And shrouds are another kind of symbolic connection between the two of them. Dalí liked to play around with shrouds, so did his friend Lorca. This sort of mystery of obscuring the face or the body, and also the idea that the shroud has something to do with death is probably sort of common possible interest. Now, their backgrounds are sort of similar in some ways, despite the fact Magritte's Belgian and Dalí's from Spain. But they both had sort of fairly sort of normal trainings. And Magritte went to the Fine Art Academy in Brussels, and Dalí to the one in Madrid, the Royal Academy of San Fernando. This did not mean that they became academic artists, but they did have that sort of training, but they didn't really sort of slot into that in the long term. And so both of them kind of subverted that. Both of them made a kind of point about working in the studio, and were, very kind of hardworking, productive artists throughout their careers. They have similar early influences, which are also the general influences of surrealism itself. So these are influences that other artists looked at. But Magritte was particularly interested in de Chirico. This is a good example of an early de Chirico. He was hugely admired by the surrealists, and he had strange senses of scale, vague interior, exterior things, odd objects, juxtaposed and displayed as sort of props in an odd kind of scenography. Of course, Dalí liked Picasso, Tanguy, and various other artists. Of course, he was very interested in Miro and Max Ernst. They both also had sort of long-standing marriages that at moments were complicated, but nevertheless they were the same women throughout their lives. So the sort of coupling is an important element that enters into their work as well. So they did have, so as you can see, Magritte met his wife very early on, and they married, and they stayed married until he died. But there was a moment when he had a fling and she had a fling. He tried to get her to, he was having a fling, and he was trying to get her to sort of be distracted with a friend of his who ended up having an affair with her. So that problem didn't last very long, and they were then back together again. And of course, as you all know, Dalí and Gala were together throughout their lives, but Dalí kind of stole her away from Paul Éluard, and then later on, of course, she had all these affairs. Magritte came to Paris in 1927. This was at the height of a very productive period of his work, very inventive, and really a large number of paintings were executed around the phase of 1927, 1928. Dalí's move to Paris came slightly later than Magritte's in 1929. He'd been there in 1926, but just for, a short trip. He did meet Picasso at that time, but he didn't really go to live in Paris until 1929, and he went there with his friend from Madrid, Luis Buñuel. They'd been in the art school together, or at least in the residence in Madrid together, and their plan was to work on Chien de Loup, the title of which may be a reference to Lorca, their mutual friend in Madrid, the poet. And of course, Miro had already gone to Paris in 1920, and he helped Dalí to have contact with the surrealists, with Breton and other key figures. So when Dalí went to Paris, he had like very, very, very good contacts. So he didn't just go to Paris and in a kind of bohemian way see what happened. He already was talking to people about exhibitions and was sort of immediately in contact with people. And of course, Magritte was one of the very first people he met when he went to Paris. So it's probable that Dalí went to Paris in the late March 1929. He wrote a series of articles for the Spanish newspaper, and from those articles we can establish that he may have been in Paris by the 22nd of March, 1929. It's often said he was there in April, but it seems he may have got there a couple of weeks earlier than that. And he was sending these articles back from Paris. And in these articles, he mentions Magritte. And he specifically mentions the painting we were looking at a few minutes ago, with the pipe. And other ones, here's a photo of Magritte, another one of these sort of selfies from the photo booth, and a painting from just before 1929, from 1928, The Invention of Life. And Dalí had a reproduction of this painting and some other ones, 2 or 3, that he kept. We don't know when he obtained them, but it's possible that he obtained them at the time when he was writing these articles for the Spanish newspaper. Because he mentioned specific paintings. It doesn't look like Dalí had yet gone to Magritte's studio, having just got to Paris, and Magritte lived out in the suburbs. So he probably either saw some of the paintings in the Gaumont gallery, and I'll come on to Gaumont in a moment, or heard in conversation things about them enough to sort of understand what they looked like, or he had access to reproductions. So he may not have actually sort of done a studio visit yet at that stage. Nevertheless, they become pretty good friends, and by the summer, Dalí invites Magritte and his wife, with other friends, to go down to Cadaqués for a month or so, in August more or less, and the other couple is Gaumont and his girlfriend, as well as probably Buñuel and possibly Miro. I doubt Miro stayed with them the month if he did go, because Miro had a place in Spain. He didn't need to go spend a month in Cadaqués. He could go to his own farm in Montroig in Tarragona, south of Barcelona, and it probably wouldn't have stayed with them that long. But he might have popped in to say hello. This is the famous summer when Dalí meets Gala, who's down there with Paul Éluard and part of the group, and they become lovers, and she stays on when Éluard goes back with their daughter, Cécile, and she stays on for a bit longer before going back to Paris, and then Dalí stays on even longer to finish the paintings he's working on for his exhibition that Gaumont is preparing for his new gallery in Paris. But Gaumont was another Belgian from Brussels, and this was to be Dalí's first solo exhibition. And Magritte was also preparing an exhibition
with Gaumont.
And they were both painting while they were down there. So Dalí's painting the paintings for his show at Gaumont's, and René Magritte's doing the same. And this particular painting, it's known, was painted in Cadaqués, apart from the landscape, which is telling. So they weren't just down there kind of vacationing. They were sort of working away, and obviously they were cultivating Gaumont's in some ways. This is one of the paintings that was in Dalí's exhibition, which took place in November, and André Breton wrote the preface for the catalog. So this was a very important first solo exhibition in Paris for Dalí. He hadn't even been there a year, and the most important French writer of the moment, or one of the most important ones, André Breton, leader of the surrealist movement, writes the preface. And Gaumont has great ambition for this gallery, with the idea of working with Dalí, Magritte, Arp, and other surrealists. Both of them had an important, tight relationship with André Breton. The first Surrealist Manifesto was published in 1924, and there was this sort of general idea of erasing the difference between dream and reality. But that first phase, which was driven by spontaneity, automatic writing, had already sort of come and gone. Dalí's coming, several years later in 1929. Magritte's kind of come in 1927. Magritte was just slightly older than Dalí by 3 or 4 years. And so they're very much the second generation. So just as all this is happening, there's a lot of internal rife within the surrealist movement, and Breton is preparing a second manifesto of surrealism, which was published in 1930, but it was first initially published in December of 1929. So dream imagery comes to the fore as a sort of interest beyond the earlier idea of spontaneity, and this is much more sort of calculated. And so the focus of the second manifesto is quite different, as well as the artists that come to the fore after 1927-28, including Arp, Tanguy, really start to have a different feel. So Magritte enters surrealism just a hair before Dalí, when he comes to Paris in 1927. And here is a statement by Breton where he talks about, on the one hand, this idea of the purely internal model, and then he actually says, this is later on, about Magritte. Magritte approached painting as though it constituted a series of object lessons. And from this point of departure, he has proceeded to put the visual image systematically on trial, taking pleasure in stressing its lapses and in demonstrating the extent to which it depends on the figures of language and thought. So painting's not dissociated from language, and in some ways it could be understood as a form of thought. Visual representation is a form of thought. It's not only writing that gets priority in terms of being an expression of thought. So in this heady moment of 1929, in the same issue where the second manifesto of surrealism is published in the magazine, the sort of official organ of the surrealist movement called the Surrealist Revolution, La Révolution surréaliste, and in the December 1929 issue, there is this group of photographs of all the members of the movement, or most of them, including Dalí and Magritte, all with their eyes closed. And these are these sort of photo booth photos. And they are surrounded, a small painting by Magritte, which is, I do not see the hidden in the forest, the nude, the woman, whatever. So there's this whole idea of a kind of internal representation in one way or another, but also something to do with language. But Breton wasn't the easiest person, and he had all these sort of falling out with many people. The people who had been involved with the movement earlier on, many of them parted company with him in 1929, 1930. And Magritte, though they had been sort of quite tight early on, has a kind of scuffle with Breton in 1929. And the surrealists were famously sort of anti-clerical. And there was a meeting of the group, and Magritte was there with his wife, and she was wearing a crucifix. And this was just beyond the pale for Breton. And something happened, and the Magrittes felt very insulted, and they stood up and walked out, and they didn't speak for 3 or 4 years. But after which time they sort of reconciled. And of course, Dalí also had his run-ins with Breton slightly later, especially in the period around 1934. And then, eventually in 1939, they have a kind of definitive rupture. Magritte, however, over the years is reconciled with Breton, and even very late in the 60s, early 60s, they're in a friendly relation, and during the 1930s as well. So Magritte, however, went back to Brussels, and he becomes engaged with the other Belgian surrealist group, and a key figure with them. And here's some photos of what they look like. They were, on the whole, a little bit more reserved. That doesn't mean they weren't provocative, but their sort of general behavior seemed a little more discreet, and yet they did engage in all sorts of subversive activities, and a number of them were members of the Communist Party, so they were sort of quite political. And Magritte himself was a member of the party on and off throughout his life. He often fell out with them, would leave the party, and then he'd sign up later on, several years later. And of course, Magritte was one of the key figures, along with people like Nugget, and Gaumont was a member of, though he was an art dealer, was a member of the group. And now, Gaumont was a very sort of brilliant dealer, but his activity in Paris was somewhat short-lived. The problem with 1929, 1930 was that the economy wasn't going very well. Dalí's first show was in November 1929. The stock market crashed in October. And of course, there was a slight delay, but things weren't very good by the spring of 1930. And of course, as we entered the 30s, the economy for the art market was weak in Paris, as it was everywhere else. So here's another photo of Gaumont with Magritte and Magritte's wife, Georgette. But the gallery did this big exhibition of collage in March 1930, which was curated and accompanied by a long essay by Louis Aragon, another key writer of surrealism, and had many, many artists in it, including Dalí and Magritte, but also Picasso, Arp, Marcel Duchamp, and several others, Ernst, and so on. That was a kind of survey of collage. And so Gaumont's idea was to have these monographic exhibitions of artists like Magritte and Dalí, and to also do some group shows. But the gallery only lasted, several months, and then it closed. Gaumont eventually goes back to Brussels, continues his activity in the group. But later on, both of them also had the same New York gallery, which was the Julian Levy gallery, that Dalí showed in 3 or 4 times during the 1930s, and Magritte in 1936, which was the beginning of his sort of the phase of him becoming a kind of international figure. Later on, he also had sort of many international exhibitions with other galleries. And also during the mid to late 1930s, they both worked with Edward James, who bought pieces by them. James had a contract with Dalí. There probably was some rivalry here because they were both trying to butter up the same collector and patron. And here we can see the painting we saw earlier, not to be reproduced, which is based on the image of Edward James, and a photo of James with a kind of Magritte mask-like, with sky images painted on it, sculpture in plaster. And the Dalís there with James, and one of the things that Dalí did for them, and also James was buying a fair number of Dalí's paintings, so he was important for both of them. Now it's probable there was some rivalry between Dalí and Magritte, and it may have come initially around this time. Later on, they're not very close, like in the 50s and 60s, and they even were capable, both of them, of saying fairly negative things about the one or the other. And we'll look at one or two reasons why that might be. And that, however, in this key period that the exhibition addresses, they were in lots of exhibitions together. And here is a selection of them. These are big, important exhibitions, many of them to do directly with the surrealist group. And so it's constant that they're in group exhibitions together. Doesn't necessarily mean they saw each other at every opening of these shows, because both of them were capable of not going to their own exhibitions. Magritte, possibly because he was spending more and more time in Brussels, although as you can see, one or two of these exhibitions took place in Brussels. And Dalí also was traveling back and forth to Spain, and sometimes had many other things distracting him. Sometimes he was going to America as we get into the later 30s, and might have been in America for one exhibit but couldn't go to another one. So we can't assume that they crossed paths at every opening, but they were seen in a context together. And there were other things that connected them. One of the 19th century writers who'd been nearly forgotten, that was greatly admired by the surrealists, was Lautréamont, whose very strange, long prose poem called The Songs of Maldoror, Les Chants de Maldoror, is both of them illustrated. And we're showing a selection of that in the exhibition, as well as quite a few documents that show these connections through this period. Now, there are things that start to look similar as you get into the mid-30s between the two of them, and this idea of kind of disjunctions, which for Dalí is the idea of the paranoid critical method, the double image, and in the case of Magritte, this idea of sort of representation being complicated. There's another variant idea of the window. Breton talks about the concept of the window, which is an old-fashioned sort of idea that goes back to the 16th century, 15th century. And here it's complicated by Magritte, this idea that painting is like looking through a window, but here it's the glass is shattered, and where is the painting? Is it on the glass? Is it outside? Is it in our mind? I mentioned the shrouds earlier and how that's common to both of them, and here you can see in our painting Shades of Night Descending, the shrouded figure and these sort of dark, threatening shadows. So we've also looked at Threatening Weather, the one that was done in Cadaqués, and though it's not quite as frequent in Dalí as it is in Magritte, this image of the tuba or musical instruments is a feature of a number of paintings by Dalí. One thing that Magritte did was to represent burning musical instruments, in particular the tubas. Of course, Dalí has his burning giraffes. Magritte explains this idea to Breton in a letter from 1934. A slightly different solution would be to present a single burning object, provided it was made of iron, a key, a sewing machine, or a trumpet, for instance. And of course, the first sort of strong representation of that is from around 1935, shortly after the letter. And there are paintings with burning keys. And more importantly, there's this 1928 painting called Burning Landscape, where again, in the center it looks like a normal landscape, but then everything is got this huge sort of burning feature. And this was a painting that Gala owned. So Dalí lived with a Magritte painting that involved flames. And probably, it's not 100% clear, but probably Éluard gave her the painting, probably around 1929 when they all first met. And she kept it at least through the 30s, when it was sold later on. And of course, Dalí was capable of painting tubas as well, even though he and Magritte occasionally refer to them as trombones, which doesn't seem to be right. But anyway, I suppose they both were, legitimately confused. And so this is a strange, little-known painting that has one from 1936. And, it's more frequent in Magritte and goes back to 1928. This one's not burning, but you've got the shrouded figure with the tuba, very mysterious. It's probable that Magritte became irritated with Dalí's borrowing of some of the images that he used in his painting. Later on, of course, Dalí seemed irritated with Magritte because he thought Magritte was a bad painter. And there's some truth in that, maybe. I mean, the sort of dexterity of the way the paint's applied is probably better in Dalí than it is in Magritte, who paints in a very sort of flat way. Now, Magritte really wasn't interested in Freud and psychoanalysis. But as I've suggested, there's a connection to language, and we could maybe compare his work to the linguist, father of modern linguistics, Saussure, who wrote the link between signified and signified is arbitrary. So language is a kind of convention. It's not written in stone. Now, in 1929, in that same issue, that was where the photo of the Magritte painting and the surrealists around them, the second manifesto, and Dalí's screenplay for Un Chien de Loup, and this Magritte text, Words and Images, were all in that same number. It's very much the sort of arrival of these two kind of new figures inside of surrealism. And he does this where he has like a set of different conventional images, but he adds words to them which are usually very far removed from the image. So you get whatever. The first one, it's a leaf and it says cannon. So there's not much connection between the image and the word. And so he shows the gulf between language and images. So in a letter to André Cerise in 1932, Magritte said, "If we accept the reality of this secret desire which justifies the use of metaphor, we can also understand why we are affected by the sight of an ordinary object placed in an unfamiliar and lonely setting. Our secret desires for a change in the order of things. The fate of an object in which we had no interest suddenly begins to disturb us." So this idea of sort of visual metaphor is important to Magritte. He actually sort of disliked the idea of psychoanalysis, at least so he said later on. This is Freud, the photograph. No one in the quotes by Magritte. "No one in his right mind believes that psychoanalysis could elucidate the world's mystery. Psychoanalysis has nothing to tell us about works of art that evoke mystery of the world." So his idea of the enigmatic was a little removed from the psychoanalytic focus that Dalí was so fascinated with. But there is a connection. This is a simple distinction, and it's probably maybe more complex to mention a third sort of figure, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, a photograph from 1974, who knew Dalí. And Lacan wrote his thesis on paranoia around 1930. And he published articles in surrealist magazines in the 1930s alongside articles by Dalí, and they were both writing about paranoia. So Lacan believed that the unconscious mind was structured like a language, and that it could be kind of explored from a linguistic point of view. As well, he was a disciple of Freud's. So perhaps the two polarizations we see in Magritte and Dalí overlap, even if they're not sort of focused on exactly the same idea. So this exhibition is largely drawn from the Magritte Museum in Brussels, and which houses a huge collection and many things that came from the estate of the artist, and is part of the Royal Museum of Fine Arts sort of nexus they have a 19th century museum and old masters collection and so on, but they've created a kind of standalone museum. The exhibition is divided into a group of concepts. They're totally arbitrary in some ways, but hopefully they'll help. And they're sort of formal categories. So the first two are seeing into and seeing through. So it's a little bit about the mystery of vision. So in Dalí, you can see it in the font, you have, you're looking into a landscape, but you also encounter these sort of odd niches with strange, enigmatic images in them. And niches which are very shallow and we look into them, but we don't see through them. Or a figure studying something which is not there. Or coming back to the idea of language, the use of speech, where we've got a very strange figure in a way, but it's not very readable, with various words, again, kind of disjointed from the whatever is being represented, with words like the body of a woman, cannon, tree. So both language and image is problematized. Or in The Imp of the Perverse by Magritte, where again we have sort of very shallow niches, as we did in the earlier Dalí, and as you can see also in diurnal fantasies, daily fantasies, where you've got this strange object in a landscape, and it has, again, these sort of shallow niches we can't see through. Or in Magritte's enormous painting, The Secret Player, where we're looking through some sort of landscape, but it's not clear what kind of space it is. There's a figure in a very shallow kind of closet. There's no kind of coherent narrative. There's this turtle flying in the air, and we've got what appear to be cricket players in some kind of garden with giant table legs turning into trees. So it's very enigmatic, and then there's a theatrical curtain. So it's a very artificial space. Or the Dalí, A Memory of the Child Woman, where this strange object that we don't know what it is has holes in it. We see through them. There's a landscape in the background. There are figures in the background. This very odd figure in the middle, and in the foreground there's another niche with sort of a collage element representing clocks and time. Now, Magritte referred to these strange shapes, which appear over and over again in his paintings in this early period, in the late 20s, early 30s, as bilboquet. And bilboquet is a kind of game, like you can see there. So the idea is you throw the ball up and try and get it on the little handle. But he doesn't represent the game. He just represents these odd sort of poles. And according to the authors of the Catalogue René, bilboquet ought to be placed within quotation marks, for what Magritte called the bilboquet is something special to himself and not the wooden cup and ball toy the word normally means plaything consisting of a small stick pointed at one end and attached by a string to a ball with a hole in it which must be maneuvered onto the point. Magritte's bilboquet rather resembles such specimens of turned wood as chessmen, skittles, balusters, table legs. Then he also adds, in some paintings, eyes into them, so they become sort of humanized and very, very odd. And they relate that also to Léger and to maybe to de Curator and those odd props that we were looking at earlier. So seeing through, here the unexpected answer. We've got this door with a kind of cutout shape, which seems to represent a figure or figures, perhaps a couple. And the Dalí, the Invisible Man, where the figure is made out of loaves of bread or suggested. Its presence is suggested by loaves of bread, and we look through a window in the background and we see what looks like the skin of a loaf of bread. So these are sort of absent presences or present absences. And it's very mysterious in the Magritte painting because we look through into this dark space we can't read. And Magritte said in a lecture in 1937 in London, "Let us make a hole in the wall next to a panel or a door, a hole which is also an exit, a door. Let us complete the coincidence by reducing the two objects to a single one. The hole appears quite naturally in the panel of the door, and through the hole we shall see darkness." And again, so this idea of cutting out things that we can either, that we can see through is shared between the two of them. So that in the Kiss by Magritte, we sort of have a landscape that's very different within another landscape. And one is sort of desert-like, and the other is very sort of lush and green. And again, the shape of the figures is perhaps like a couple embracing. Or the Dalí weaning of furniture nutrition with the sort of female figure who's mending the nets, has kind of a hole cut out through her, and we see through her to the landscape beyond, and there's another double image cutout. Or Magritte's Skybird from 1966, the latest painting in the exhibition, where we see through a kind of silhouette into the sky. So again, Maldor is important for both of them, and that's full of strange juxtapositions, metaphors that don't make sense, and that lead to bizarre sense of humor. And as Dalí had been interested in film, and later on Magritte made quite a few sort of pretty low-tech sort of surrealist home movies in the 1950s and 60s, some of which are on view. Another category that unites them is nudes and bodies. Here we can see Dalí doing a kind of standard academic nude, but in a kind of slightly more modern style. And Magritte playing around with the idea of texture as well in Discovery, where there's a kind of wood grain texture to the skin of the female figure. Now, he was capable of borrowing from photography. There's a lot of collage and logic in Magritte, where he's juxtaposing things that are maybe they're sources that are cut out, reproductions, representations of old paintings, classical art, etc., etc. And here we have this sort of torso, which is based on a plaster torso that the artist had in his studio. This balloon in the background, and otherwise a very empty landscape. Or this comparison, Dalí's portrait of Gala, which is almost certainly based on a photograph, and Magritte's Black Magic, where the figure kind of blends into the skyscape of the background of the picture from 1945. And there were multiple versions of this painting. Magritte said, "It is an act of black magic to turn a woman's flesh into sky." So that's the origin of the title. And both of them played around with sculpture, again, with similar playfulness. Dalí's Venus de Milo with drawers, conceived in 1936, At the time, the idea of the surrealist object was becoming important, with its drawers cut out of the figure and its furry pom-poms, and Magritte with the copper handcuffs from 1931, and again he comes back to it in 1936, same year as the Dalí. He does 2 or 3 versions of it, and it's a small painted, the original was a small painted plaster, the one we're showing is a painted bronze. And so in the case of the Dalí, the white makes it feel like marble, and in the case of the Magritte, he's added the flesh tone and he's colorized the drapery and painted the face white and so on and so forth. So he says in a letter to Breton in 1936, when the surrealists were preparing an exhibition of surrealist objects, and this was an activity both of them were very involved in. The object is reminiscent of the mask on which I used to paint sky or a forest. Here, the head is white, the body is flesh-colored, the drapery is blue, the base and the arms and feet are black. In my opinion, this gives the Venus an unexpected life. Another connection is double images. Kind of comes to the fore through the mid to late 30s in Dalí, into the 40s, and here's one example from our collection you'll be very familiar with the kind of cut-out images and multiple images, and there's this sort of machine of production of double and triple images, or the Magritte, the Flavor of Tears, where the sort of plant becomes a bird, and yet the plant's being sort of eaten away. Again, we're in this strange theatrical setting. Are we outdoors? Are we indoors? There's a landscape in the background with some sort of island, it seems. Another variant related idea is this one, Treasure Island from 1942. Again, with the plant bird motif. Birds are, of course, important images in surrealism for a lot of different artists, Max Ernst, for example. But here he's also probably thinking about a literary reference to the Robert Louis Stevenson Treasure Island. So he loved to read. We've mentioned the musical instruments and tubas, and of course Dalí's burning giraffes. And that is, again, a kind of point of potential conflict between them. Both of them approach space in an irrational way. Here, in the Magritte, forbidden literature, the use of speech. That subtitle, the use of speech, is used more than once in Magritte. It comes back to the point about language. We presented with a staircase that leads us to nowhere. It's an interior. There's this finger, a sphere, and the reference is to Irene, who was one of the, Irene Hamoir, who was one of the Belgian surrealists. The Dalí morphological echo, where there seem to be ruin-like buildings that it's not clear what sort of function they perform. This archway that doesn't seem to serve any pragmatic point of view, or again, the confusion of interior and exterior, and the telephone in a dish from 1939, where we seem possibly to be indoors, but we seem also to be in a plaza. Everything is cast in a gloomy, foreboding shadows. Figures walk around in the background. And yet there's a plate with sardines and a telephone on it. Very, very enigmatic. And again, there are a number of images of both of them with their wives that are quite staged, almost deliberately. So, of course, Dalí liked to co-sign his paintings, Gala and Salvador. And in the case of Magritte, so many of the female figures, including the painting Black Magic we were looking at, are based on Georgette. So the final point of contact is this idea of fetishism. It's also related to the idea of the surrealist object, which starts around 1931. And Dalí's one of the big practitioners of that and writes about it in another one of the surrealist publications. This piece by Dalí with the shoe, which points to Gala and the idea of the part-whole relationship, and again to psychoanalysis, is very mysterious and was reproduced in 1931. And the Magritte painting God is No Saint, where you've got this odd juxtaposition of a bird with a woman's shoe. Or deliberate distortions of sort of body parts, which is one of the definitions of fetishism that was offered by Freud. Dalí's Javanese mannequin, where there's this sort of extended buttocks propped up on a crutch, or Magritte's The Philosopher's Lamp from 1936, with this extended nose going into the pipe and this strange organic candle, snake-like. And this was shown in the Surrealist exhibition in London in 1936. Again, an exhibition they were both in. Or the early painting, Magritte's The Midnight Marriage, where you've got this sort of truncated head, this sort of stand with a wig, sort of separating the idea of hair from the body, and very, very odd stone-like forms. Are we on a terrace? Are we outdoors? There are trees in the background, but they seem to be upside down. There's a mirror to the left. It's a very, very strange and disorienting painting. Again, focused on sort of body parts, and that idea for Freud of fetishism was to desire displaced to sort of body parts or objects, was sort of how he talked about it. And that even comes into play in Dalí's Shades of Night Descending, where in some ways the body shrouded becomes fetishized, and there's also a kind of woman's shoe underneath the shroud and a glass, and so again these objects that are sort of displaced desire. So, and I'll end with this comparison. Going back to Dalí's first exhibition in Paris in 1929, The First Days of Spring was included, and in it's full of Freudian parables and strange objects and strange little narratives. And it was also seen in the Gaumont exhibition in the spring of 1930. And this beautiful little Magritte, The Interpretation of Dreams, where we have the shoe and the moon, or the hat and snow, this kind of linguistic disjunction. Though this is a later gouache, it's based on a composition from right around 1930 that Magritte did first as a painting, and then later came back and made this gouache in the 1950s. But it shows two different approaches in a way to collage, the idea of the separation of the object from language and the sort of categorization of it in a kind of lexicon that doesn't make sense, or Dalí's fragmented little narratives that point to the dream world, the unknown, the Oedipus complex, the idea of repressed sexual desire, the idea of the sort of gift, all these sort of ideas that probably come more from Freud, and he'd been very steeped in reading Freud at this time. Though they seem very, very different, I hope I've shown that there's a connection between them, and I hope it's evident in the exhibition. So thank you very much.